think nationalism is one of the most difficult questions for anarchists to deal with, and frankly I don't think we've dealt with it very well. On the one hand, of course, nationalism contradicts anarchist philosophy, because nationalism as an ideology that believes that every person should identify with a particular territory or a language or a culture and a state to go along with it, that's a clear violation of anarchist principles. But and so I understand why anarchists often reject nationalism completely. And I think in a free world we will not have any nations. But I think what anarchists don't always do is recognize the role that national liberation struggles have sometimes played in challenging imperialism and in challenging capitalism, and that therefore nationalism sometimes has opportunities as well as problems. Nationalism is a contradictory phenomenon. In the United States, I think black nationalism is a perfect example of that. Yes, we can all point to forms of black nationalism that are narrow-minded and chauvinistic, and that you might want to say are black supremacist or something. You can find those kind of organizations or crackpot groups sprinkled throughout the United States, sure. But if you look at an organization like the Black Panther Party, that was black nationalist, that believed in black power, but also was not afraid to work with white folks, and that also had a strong analysis of capitalism and colonialism, and that basically argued, the Panthers or Malcolm X argued that before we can build a broad working class, black folks need to organize themselves, because we have been so broken apart by the system of slavery and segregation that we now need to come together amongst ourselves first before we can unite with other groups on a basis of strength. That sort of nationalism seems to me to be potentially useful. It might always have dangers and pitfalls that have to be avoided, and I think, but it doesn't mean that nationalism is necessarily a reactionary force in the struggle for a free world. And I think the political, the revolutionary and the revolutionary Frantz Fanon, I think, has probably the best analysis of it. And when Fanon, who was in Algeria struggling against French colonialism, and he said nationalism was necessary in that first phase of the revolution in order for the Algerians to come together as one in order to overthrow the French imperialists. But almost as soon as that happens, then nationalism became an obstacle, because then the middle class Algerians began to see themselves as the new rulers, the new elites, and to speak for the working class. And he said at that point we need to shift from national consciousness to social consciousness, which I think he means by class consciousness, and that those middle class forces need to be swept away, or at least subordinated to the larger working class struggle. And at that point, nationalism becomes a fetter rather than a means to liberation. That seems to me to be a much more useful way of understanding nationalism, especially in places like the United States, or maybe if you want to think about Palestinian nationalism, for example, than a simple blanket rejection